Let's get started. What's going on, everybody out there? Welcome back to Jesus School here on Through Confusion. We are going cover to cover through the Bible to answer the confusing questions that we all have, that skeptics bring up, so that we know what the Bible is actually saying. We're here every Friday morning at 6 a.m. Pacific time. So if you're new, join us. It's a great journey going through the Bible. That's what we're doing so that you can stay equipped. On this specific episode, we're continuing to break down this video from Kristi Burke, 5 Bible passages that caused me to lose my faith. This is passage number 4. In the passage for today is found in the book of Deuteronomy, like last week was, but Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 10 through 15. These are a portion of scripture that regard war laws. So when God is establishing Israel as a nation, then obviously nations have militaries. They need to protect themselves. And so these laws are specifically how the nation of Israel would conduct war with other nations. In the world we live in, not everything's perfect. It's a fallen world. And so the thing that was cool about this specific set of laws is that the nations around them, they just practiced total warfare. They didn't have any rules when it came to war. The only thing was to kill the other guy. So there was no ethics. There was no morality. Just as brutal as you can get. That's what war was back then. So we're going to get a different picture of that in the Bible. The difference also between God regulating something and approving something is very big. The Bible talks a lot about things that God is regulating. Because we live in a world with sinful people, there has to be regulations. That doesn't necessarily mean God approves of this. The great example is when Jesus is asked about divorce. And he said, if God didn't want this, why did Moses give a command on how to divorce? And Jesus's reply was, at the beginning it wasn't so, but because of the hardness of your hearts, God permitted you to give a certificate of divorce, showing that God is regulating this, giving a way to do this, but he's not approving of it. In Hosea, it says God hates divorce. So we need to understand that. And also, I would like to say, when we go through this video, I think it's really fascinating because our modern day civil rights and humanitarian fixes for these kind of things are actually pretty much the exact same as God prescribed in the law. We haven't come very far in terms of how we can do this better. So without further ado, let's roll this clip and see what Kristi Burke has to say.
The fourth passage that I had a really difficult time with, that I still cannot find a good justification for, is in Deuteronomy 20, 10 through 18. When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, all the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. If they refuse to make peace and they engage you in battle, lay siege to the city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to sword all the men in it. As for the women, the children, the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take.
All right. So just to start off, I went a little far on that clip. Sorry. But just to start off, we're going to break down this passage, but I'm so sorry. Let's run that back. We're going to run through this whole clip. I totally got confused at where I was on this. Let's run it back and listen to that whole clip one more time.
In it. The fourth passage that I had a really difficult time with, that I still cannot find a good justification for, is in Deuteronomy 20, 10 through 18. When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, All the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. If they refuse to make peace and they engage you in battle, lay siege to the city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to sword all the men in it. As for the women, the children, the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take these as plunder for yourselves, and you may use the plunder the Lord your God gives you from your enemies. This is how you are to treat all cities that are at a distance from you and do not belong to the nations nearby. So God is commanding his people to go around to all the neighboring cities, to offer them peace, to say, hey, we're giving you a peace offering. Would you like to make peace with us? And if that city agrees to being peaceful with you, you are to capture them and enslave them. You are to force them to work for you, to be your slaves. So right here, right on in the very beginning, it's saying to harm people that are peaceful with you, to force them to work for you, to enslave them. This is God specifically endorsing and commanding you to enslave other people, even if they're peaceful. Then it says,
Okay, so there's a lot to get into in this very first section, but what she said here is God is literally telling his people to go around to all the neighboring cities and make them an offering of peace, and if they are peaceful, to make them slaves. Let's read this passage one more time. So that's Kristi's paraphrase. Let's go back to this passage, read it one more time. It says in verse 10, when you go near a city to fight against it, then proclaim an offer of peace to it. Okay, so there's a bunch of things Kristi gets absolutely wrong. God, for one, is not telling them to go around to all the cities around them and just fight against them for no reason. She totally made that up. If she would have read verse 1 in this chapter, then she would know the context of the verse. Verse 1 says, when you go out to fight your enemies. They're not commanded to go around and make war with just everyone, like all the other nations did when they went to war against whoever they wanted to go to war with. That is not at all. On the contrary, they're actually prohibited from doing that, from just making war against anyone that they want. So the people who are fighting against their enemies, if she read a little bit further in verse 1, it says that they came against them with chariots and horses. That's Deuteronomy 20, verse 1. So when your enemies come to fight against you with chariots and horses, then this is what you're gonna do, and this is how you attack them back. That's what this whole passage is. So it sounds like somebody else is instigating something against you, and I hope she believes that self-defense is a right that we all have. I hope she doesn't think we shouldn't defend ourselves, whether on a personal level or at a national level. If somebody's coming against you, you have the right to defend yourself. And I don't think we need to have that debate. But this specific passage is talking about their enemies coming against them with all their weapons, and then how you fight back against them. He doesn't... Okay, sorry. Okay, so where were we? Let's get back to the next part of the verse. It says, God says to Israel, go attack all the cities around you at your own will. No, it doesn't. It says, wait, in fact, go to these people that are fighting against you. Go to these nations that are attacking you. And when you go around them to fight them, what did it say in verse 10? Then proclaim an offer of peace to it. So you're telling me that God is not just allowing you to go attack your enemies that have just attacked you without first offering them peace. Without first saying, okay, we know you attacked us, but we won't kill you all if you agree to these terms of peace with us. So Kristi, God's not just saying go against and fight every other nation He's not just saying go enslave all the nations. He's saying go to these people that are fighting against you. And instead of just retaliating on the basis of, I am angry at you, you just came against us, you have to offer them an offer of peace. All right, so let's go on verse 11. And it shall be that if they accept your offer of peace and open to you, then all the people who are found in it shall be placed under tribute and serve you. Okay, so they open the door to you. You've offered them this peace. You have to honor the peace treaty that you offered them. You can't just say, oh, you open the door, now we go in and we slaughter you because you just came and attacked us. No, you cannot do that. So let's work this out. They aren't just allowed to remain autonomous. This city, why would God say you need to offer them peace and then subject them to forced labor? Okay, what does he mean by that? Of course, when you go to the city, they're not just going to maintain their autonomy because now they're under your rulership. They're under your king. If they want to, now you take that place over. Now they have to be a part of what you're doing and pay taxes, just like everybody else. They have to be subject to your kingdom's rules, just like everybody else. So that's what he's saying. And put them to forced labor. They have to do things for your kingdom. They can't just go on scheming against you, fighting against you. These people were fighting. These people were coming against you from the very start. So let's put it into modern day terms. When any country wins a war, there's usually an obligatory war treaty that they make the other losing nation sign. The Potsdam Agreement was what came out of World War II, right? And Germany had to pay reparations. They had to restructure their economy. They weren't allowed to spend their resources doing certain things that they wanted to develop in their economy, but they had to move back to agriculture so that they could supply food for the rest of Europe. So they were put under these strict laws. And then they had a military occupation. Germany was literally divided into 4 parts. And the Brits took one, America took one, the Russians took one. It was divided. This is like how it gets handled today. So what you're saying, oh, that's so messed up that because they lost the war, now they have to pay back the things that were lost in the war that they started. That's how it goes. This is still how it happens today with all of the civil rights, with all of the anti-racism stuff. This is exactly how it happens. And also, Kristi, this literally doesn't negate any of the laws about treatment of slaves that we're going to get into later in this video that God clearly outlined way before this. In Exodus chapter 21, he talks all about how you treat your slaves. We're going to get into that. Nonetheless, they weren't just allowed to murder their enemies because their enemies attacked them. They weren't just allowed to do whatever they wanted to them. God says, when you go against your enemies to attack them, one, you're required to offer them an offer of peace. So if you want an example of this, go read Joshua 9. When the Gibeonites tricked Joshua and the Israelites into thinking they were a people far off and made this treaty with them, then Joshua had to honor that treaty. He had to say, no, we're peaceable with you, and they subjected them to forced labor. They had to be a part of their kingdom since they made this peace treaty, since they said they would be at peace, but they couldn't harm them. They couldn't do whatever they wanted with them, but they did put them to work on their projects. Just think about the jail system today. Okay, maybe you say it's unjust, but when people are in jail, they have to work. They don't just get to eat and live and do all these things for free. They have to do something. They have to provide for something. Okay, Let's continue on with what Kristi has to say. She got that first part pretty wrong in her analysis. So let's continue on.
As if they are not peaceful, then you are to just kill them all. Kill every single one of them, and then take the women and children as plunder and do whatever with the plunder that you want to do. Those are the spoils of your war. What do you think that means? Like, what do you think it was intended when they said, take the women and children and do whatever you want with them? And then in verse 15, it says,
okay, so she makes a really rough, let's get back to the camera. Okay, so she makes a really rough paraphrase of this section, alluding to, one, she says, you have to kill them all. Obviously, that's not what it says in this verse. And then she also says, you can do whatever you want with the women and children. Very, very rough paraphrase. She's alluding to a lot of things that aren't at all in the text. Now, let's read this. Deuteronomy 20, verses 12 through 14. Now, if the city will not make peace with you, remember, these are the people who attacked you. If they will not make peace with you, but war against you, then you shall besiege it. And when the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, you shall strike every male in it with the edge of the sword. But the woman and the little ones and the livestock and all that is in the city, all its spoil, you shall plunder for yourself. And you shall eat the enemy's plunder, which the Lord your God gives you. Okay, so this enemy group that will not make peace with you, they say, no, we are going to war with you. And now we've attacked you. Now you've come to get your stuff back and you've besieged us. You've come around the city. Who are the people who are fighting? Who are the people who are making war against them? Of course, it's the men of the city. And so you have to fight against the men and strike them with a sword. That's what happens in battle. That's what's happening in Russia and Ukraine right now. The men are fighting the war, right? But you can't just kill everybody. No, not like Kristi said. You cannot kill everybody like all the other nations would do in their total warfare. No, you cannot do that. You have to leave the women, the children alive, everything of value you're allowed to take. You can't just do whatever you want. Those men, what do you think when you enter the city after you've besieged it? They're not going to fight you. You're just going to go in there and they're just going to be like, hey, we wanted peace. No, those people are going to be defending their city. It's going to be war. It's going to be exactly what happens. This literally to me seems like the same exact thing as the Geneva Convention rules that the world operates under right now. You can fight combatants in the military, but you have to leave civilians alone and alive. So that's literally killing the men with guns and leaving the women and children alive. Exactly what happens here. Let me ask you, Kristi, what do you think? If you're a nation and another nation keeps attacking you and refuses to make peace with you, but rather keeps fighting you, you literally, don't you think you don't have any other option? Like if they keep launching missiles at you, doing attacks on you, you literally don't have any other option but to go back and fight against them. And this was like 3,000 years ago, the command that God had given the people of Israel. And all this time, we literally have the same rules. All this time, 3,000 years later, the rules haven't changed with the Geneva Convention, with the UN. It sounds pretty ethical to me if you actually read it in context and you don't do what Kristi did and just assume that it all means something way worse than it actually does. Then moving on to this next part, Kristi literally alludes to the fact that, like, what's God saying? Do whatever you want with the women and children. It's not at all what he said. He said you have to keep the women and little ones and the livestock and all of the city. You have to spare that. And then it's for you, depending on what translation, it's your plunder or spoil, whatever that is. But all of a sudden, Kristi just thinks this negates the whole rest of the Old Testament, that it negates the laws that literally God gave them in Exodus 21, right before that. We literally just went over last week in Deuteronomy 22:25. If she would have understood that in the verse she did in the video before, then she would understand that rape is punishable by death. And it's still punishable by death, whether you are in a war or whether you are in your own city. You're not allowed to just go and rape a bunch of women. So whatever he means by do whatever you want with the women and children, which is Kristi's paraphrase, it doesn't mean you can do that with them. It doesn't mean you can rape them. It doesn't mean you can harm them. The Jewish law was that there was no legal sex outside of marriage. So anytime you're having sex outside of marriage, it was illegal. Like we covered last week, if you're two young people in love, the law just says get married. That's what you should do. But other than that, you're not allowed to have sex outside of marriage. That's literally just what it says in the Levitical laws, in Leviticus 18:19. That's what it says in Exodus. That's what it says in Deuteronomy. And then if we go to the very next chapter, if we go to Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 through 14, so the chapter after he's talking about what to do in the war, he actually tells you what to do if you want to take one of these captive women to be your wife. So if you are in love with one of them, if you do find one of them beautiful and you want to marry them, then there's a whole outline of how you were to do that. And they receive all the rights of a wife. You can't just divorce her with no punishment. You can't be brutalizing her. You can't do any harm to her. She's your wife. You have to love her. It literally commands you that you have to love her. So you literally get all the protections of a wife. If your city gets ransacked, you get a month to mourn. God outlines all of these things in the very next chapter. So it clearly does not mean do whatever you want with the women and children, because there's laws protecting that. Now, let's go to the laws of servitude and slavery, because when Kristi is talking about that, you're subjecting this whole city to forced labor, they're going to be your slaves. She assumes that this is like chattel slavery, that there's no rights for these slaves, that they're just going to be abused, beaten, killed. That is not at all the case. If you read through the Old Testament, over and over again in the law, God says, remember that you were slaves yourselves in Egypt. So remember that in the way that you treat these slaves, because it wasn't fun. It wasn't good for you when they treated you wrong, when they beat you, when they harmed you. So God has this reminder, this constant reminder of how the people of Israel should treat their slaves. And so it's kind of this backdoor way of dealing with this issue that is global. All civilizations have had slaves for all of time. There's literally none guilty. Probably in every single human lineage, you've either been a slave, you've been a slave and a slave owner. So I think it goes all the way around the world for all times. Every skin color has enslaved every other skin color. There's no distinction, no differentiation with that. So God handles it in changing the laws on how you treat the slaves and the rights for the slaves. When we read through this, let's just do a little, this is just good to know. The English word slave and servant has two very different meanings in our English vocabulary. Like if you think of a servant, you're probably thinking of something very different than a slave. But the word ibed, which is Hebrew Strong's 5647, you can see it below linked. It's used for both words. And in some passages, it's translated slave. In some passages, it's translated servant. Throughout the whole Old Testament, those laws, when it says, oh, this is how you should treat a servant, and then it says, if a slave does this, it's talking about the same thing. they're the same category of people. So don't misread this by saying, oh, that's talking about slaves. These are the laws talking about servants. It's the same thing. You can do a word study. Let me know if you find anything different. That's the conclusion I came to. So let's think, or let's learn a little bit about what slavery or servitude was in the Old Testament, right? It was for a certain amount of time. You could be a slave for 7 years. That was like the maximum amount of time, unless you wanted to do it longer, and then it was till the year of Jubilee, which would happen every 50 years. So that could be up to 50 years, but could be shorter than that. You were doing this to either pay back a debt that you owed someone, or that you needed food, you needed shelter, you needed protection from the hands of a master. And so then you would offer yourself as a slave or as a servant. So this was a very normal part of their culture. Like if you just were gonna be an employee in today's day and age, you were a servant, you were a slave. You would join yourself to somebody else's house. They would take care of you. You would be a part of what they're doing. So this was very common and not at all what we think of as slavery. Yes, you could go and there would be slaves taken from different places, but there's laws concerning that. So Exodus 21, it says there are protections for slaves. In verse 20, if you beat your slave or your servant to death, then it says you should be avenged. That word for avenged is life for life. You will be avenged. If you beat your servant and they die, then you will be avenged. It says if they don't die immediately, then you won't be avenged. Like you won't have the death penalty. But if you, right after that, it says if you break your servant's eye, your tooth, if you abuse your servant, then they get to go for free. They get to just leave. And so there was all these protections. You couldn't just do whatever you wanted with a servant or a slave. If you abuse your slave, if they were mutilated in any way, you would have to let them go free. And then if you take a slave as a wife, this is a concubine, right? It's a wife, but they don't have all the rights to the inheritance, but you have to treat them the same. You have to love them. You have to take care of them and provide for their needs, food, shelter, living. So this was just a big part of the culture back then, and it's not at all what you think it was. They didn't live in a time where there was governmental systems that were helping out with every single thing, that were magically providing their needs at the cost of their freedom, right? You could just go to your neighbor and you would ask your neighbor, and your neighbor was required to help you, and they were going to treat you well. This is the law that God outlined for them. So in other words, I'm sorry, Kristi, but it seems like a pretty dang reasonable passage, a pretty dang reasonable Bible passage. And I don't think we've come up with anything better in our world today. We just pawn that off to governments that actually don't care about the individuals, rather than saying, hey, people, you should take care of this. So like, what happens when a nation goes and fights against another nation because they've been at war, and then a bunch of the men die in that place? What happens to the women and children? They're left to fend for themselves by themselves. And so to naturalize and be a part of this other group is actually a better thing for them than to just have to survive on their own. So let's roll the next section of this clip to the end and see what Kristi has to say.
This is how you were to treat all cities that are at a distance from you and don't belong to the nations nearby. This is xenophobia. This is genocide. This is God endorsing slavery. All right here in this, just this small little passage. There is no justification for that. There's no reason that an all-powerful, fully benevolent God would command his people to do this to other people. And I can appreciate this as a book that is a commentary on the struggles of people at that time, written by men, but I cannot accept this as some kind of divinely inspired word of God meant to provide a moral code for all people on earth. And the last verse that I want to bring up that I think was very, very...
Okay, so the reason that I'm doing this, the reason that I'm going through this clip is because Kristi is trying to, and she's convinced in her own mind that the Bible is really an immoral book, that it's monstrous, that these passages are really bad. But I hope that you get this out of this. She's not reading the Bible in its context. She's not reading these passages in its context. And she's reading so much of her own thought into what these passages are actually saying. And she's totally not reading what the passage is actually saying. So if she would have read this whole chapter and not just taken these 5 verses out of context, right? She just said, but these, in verse 15, but these are the instructions that apply to all the distant towns, not to the towns of the nations in the land you will enter. God, let me just preface this. God is not saying, hey, Israel, your job is to conquer the whole entire world. Please go march up to the door of every single city on earth and say peace or war. And then if they say peace, make them slaves, and if they say war, kill them all. That is not at all what God is saying. God is saying, when you come into the land, you're going to fight against the nations that are in the land. Now, for every other nation that you end up being in a war with, this is how you must conduct yourselves. Not this instruction applies to you need to go fight every other country, you need to go fight every other city. No, this is how you would fight one of those cities if it came to a time of war and you couldn't make peace with that city. That's what God's saying. It's absolutely ridiculous what Kristi is saying here. That she actually thinks that God is literally telling Israel, go actually fight every single other nation. It's ridiculous. God said, I'm giving you this specific land, conquer that land. Because the people were at a time for judgment that God had said, it's been 500 years of them sinning against me, of them not turning, and now it's time for them to be judged. Mind you, God did the same exact thing for Israel. When Israel was in the land for 490 years, God kicked them out of the land. God judged them. So God isn't showing favoritism to one people group and not to another. God is saying all people need to follow me. All people need to repent and honor me in the way that they're living. And if they live unjust, then they're going to get kicked out of the land. That's what God is saying. But these specific rules are so far ahead of their time because all of the other rules of that time of war were just go annihilate the other people. Do whatever you want with them. And then God was like, actually, people of Israel, you guys are a different kind of people. You're a people called out. And this is how you're gonna handle it when a nation comes against you to attack you, to overthrow you, separate from the commands that I gave you about the specific people. That's why there's a distinction here. It's just really, really crazy to me how quickly Kristi can read these passages to mean something that they're totally not saying. And I think that's almost the most honest interpretation of these passages. I'm not trying to read anything into them. I think this is just actually what it is saying. So if you have any other ideas about this, if you have any other thoughts, be sure to leave them in the comments. I really hope this broke down this verse for you. Basically, God is saying, go to war with everybody and do whatever you want in that war, when it's actually quite the opposite. God is saying, when people come attack you, you must offer them peace. If they don't go for peace, then you must spare the women and the children. This is out of 3,000 years of history since God gave this to them. We've come to the exact same conclusion. We have literally operating under the Geneva Convention. We are trying to do war the exact same way that God prescribed in this passage. So I'm sorry, Kristi. I hope you come to understand what this passage is actually saying. And thank you all for watching this. I hope you learned something new. I hope it was beneficial. And I hope you see that God is actually just so wise. God is so just. And God has such a big plan for his people, us included, for how we should operate in the world. And reading the New Testament, reading the Old Testament, his word is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. It guides us through our day. Like James says in James chapter 1, if you lack wisdom, ask of God. He'll give to you liberally without reproach. God knows how it works. He knows the right thing to do. He knows the wrong thing to do. And the Bible is so full of wisdom, guidance on how to do the right thing, how to live out a life that's fearing God, that's honoring to people, that's loving the people around you. There's no other book like that. If you read the Quran says take as many wives. The Quran says exactly what Kristi is saying. That's what it says. The Bible is a completely separate book with completely separate ethics. And honestly, how much we've come in the last 3,000 years, we're at the same exact place. So if you enjoy this video, be sure to hit that like button. Thank you so much for going through this journey with me. Next week, we got John 3:16, the final verse in this video. So be sure to be there at 6 a.m. Friday morning to watch it live. God bless you all. Have a great week and see you next time.